This fall, my wife and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary, so we decided to visit Paris, France. We flew from Indianapolis, Indiana, overnight to Paris. Good morning. We've flown all night. We're about ready to land in Paris. We're only 8 miles away from the airport, so we're preparing for landing.
And croissants.
We arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. It is the second busiest airport in all of Europe. The morning was kind of rainy and overcast, and we got there at about 8 a.m. After taking some time to deboard the plane, we headed into the airport and went through customs. After getting through customs, we went outside and waited for our transport to the hotel. Our hotel was in the Montmartre district of Paris. That is a district that is on a large hill. Our hotel wasn't ready yet since we arrived in the morning, so we left our luggage and we decided to tour around that area. A few blocks from our hotel was the famous Moulin Rouge. After walking by there, we decided to go up to the top of the hill and visit the area around the Sacre-Coeur. The Sacre-Coeur is the second most visited monument in Paris. And the view from the top of the hill is just amazing. The Sacre-Coeur is a beautiful Catholic cathedral, and it was a wonderful place to visit. Outside this area is an artist's square, and it was a great place where we decided to sit down and have lunch. This was our first meal in Paris, and it did not disappoint. After people eat in Paris, they spend a lot of time in the cafes, and here are some men playing chess. Seemed like they were sitting there for hours. Once we left the restaurant, we decided to walk around Montmartre and see the beautiful buildings. There is also still a working vineyard right in the middle of Montmartre. We were then able to check into our hotel and get all settled. In typical European fashion, it was a lovely but small room, but it was a wonderful accommodation for our week in Paris. We then got on a big bus and went and toured the city. And at the heart of Paris is the Seine River. The Seine dissects Paris into the North and South Bank. There are 37 different bridges that cross the river in Paris. 5 of these are pedestrian bridges and 2 are for rail traffic. Along the river are beautiful, old, historic buildings and many museums. And one of these buildings is the Notre Dame Cathedral. The cathedral is 400 feet long, and there are 2 towers on the front that are 200 feet high. There are 387 steps that you have to go up to reach the top of the tower. Unfortunately, due to a fire April 15th of this year, the cathedral is closed and we were not able to go inside. As we continued our bus tour, we made our way past the National Assembly. and then went by the Grand Palace. We were then on the Champs-Élysées. Since 1975, it has been the finish line for the most famous bicycle race in the world, the Tour de France. Along the Champs, there are many cafes, theaters, and luxury shopping. And our first night in Paris ended at the iconic Eiffel Tower. Seeing the Eiffel Tower light up at night is one of the most magical and spectacular things I saw on our entire trip. It is a beautiful sight and one I will never forget. The next morning, we got up early and made our way to the subway station. Paris has a wonderful subway system that is clean, and after a few days, and you figure it out, it's easy to navigate. We made our way to the Louvre. We got there early, before the crowds, and we actually got there as soon as it opened. And the reason we got there so early was to see the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is probably the most famous piece of artwork in the world. The Louvre is the most famous, the largest, and the most visited art museum in the world. It first opened on August 10th of 1793. This was the first anniversary of the monarch's demise. One of my least favorite things to see in the Louvre was the tapestries. I'm just not a big fan of those. But here you can see a room filled with tapestries. The Louvre is a huge building. It is home to 380,000 objects, and there are over 35,000 works of art. Probably the favorite thing that we saw in the Louvre of mine were the sculptures. I was just amazed by how a person could take a block of stone and carve it into an object that just looked so perfect. Besides the Mona Lisa, there are just thousands and thousands of other works of art in the Louvre that are just massive and impressive, and they are definitely worth a visit. You could easily get lost and spend several days wandering through all the rooms at the Louvre, looking at all the impressive art. It would take you months to look at every object and every artwork in the entire gallery. After leaving the Louvre, the weather had cleared up, and so we decided to go outside and visit the grounds around the Louvre. It was a beautiful place, and one of our favorite things to see were the pyramids. The glass pyramids are amazing, and they are home to many pictures and Instagram posts, and so we had to take a few ourselves. Here is me holding up the pyramid by my fingertips. We headed back down to the river and then decided to make our way down towards Sainte-Chapelle. We walked through some markets along the way. Sainte-Chapelle has the largest collection of original stained glass in the entire world. And just seeing the stained glass was worth a visit. Sainte-Chapelle is 13th century Gothic architecture, and it was built by Louis IX. It was one of the most impressive things we saw while we were in Paris. After leaving there, we strolled through some more markets Their markets are beautiful with all fresh flowers. And then we decided to head to Les Caves du Louvre for a wine tour and tasting. Wine is very important to the French, and this was one of the most famous cellars in ancient times because it was only a few blocks from the Louvre. It was a beautiful place, and we enjoyed our tour and getting to know about the history of wine in France. We then headed to the Muséum d'Orsay, which is a museum that holds many impressionist works of France. And around every corner, there are masterpieces that you could just enjoy for hours. We had a wonderful time visiting this museum. That night, as the sun was beginning to set, we decided to head to the Eiffel Tower and get on a river cruise. A cruise is a great way to see the city. You go by many of the wonderful and famous buildings, monuments, and museums in all of Paris. And to take this cruise at sunset was just an amazing experience. And one of these iconic buildings that we saw again from the cruise was Notre Dame. And like we talked about before, it was affected by a fire and burned in April of 2019. The front of the building is intact, but there was a lot of repairs going on in the back, and you can see scaffolding around much of the building. Along the river are many parks, and you can see people running and biking and walking. There are cafes where people sit and eat. The river is just a beautiful place, and it's a place that when you're in Paris, you just have to come and enjoy. As night began to fall, we were making our way back to the Eiffel Tower. And again, the Eiffel Tower is just spectacular to see at night. Paris is often called the City of Light. And one of the reasons is because it was the first large European city to use gas streetlights. And it used these on a large scale. By 1860, there were 56,000 streetlights that lined the boulevards and streets of Paris. But today, the center of those lights is the Eiffel Tower at night. And again, it does not disappoint.
And cruise is almost over. For your safety, please remain seated until the complete stop upward.
After a good night's sleep, the next morning we got up and headed down to the Arc de Triomphe. It is an impressive monument that is at the end of the Champs Elysees. At the Arc is the eternal flame, which is dedicated to fallen war soldiers. It is the home of the unknown soldier. The Arc is an impressive monument, but one of the best things to do is walk up the stairs, the spiral staircase, to the top and look at the view of Paris from above. The Arc is 50 meters high, and from it, you can see all over Paris. One of the things that was interesting to see is how most of the boulevards are all tree-lined. The view from the top was amazing, and it is worth taking those stairs and walking up. Here is just a quick glimpse of the stairs. After visiting the Ark, we made our way down the Champs and visited some of the bakeries and shops along the way. After that, we headed to the Paris Aquarium. It was a fun place to visit. There are over 500 different species of fish and aquatic life. And it was just peaceful looking at all the different things. There were starfish, and seahorses. There were stingrays, and all kinds of exotic fish. But my absolute favorite thing had to be the jellyfish. They were so peaceful, and I could have sat and just watched them for hours. After leaving the aquarium, we headed to the metro and then went to Montparnasse Tower. It is the only skyscraper in Paris, and it is 689 feet tall. The view from the 56th observation terrace was amazing. And again, just like the Ark, you could see all of Paris, and it was beautiful to see the sights. After leaving there, my wife and I headed to Luxembourg Gardens and Palace. The gardens were beautiful, and it was a beautiful day, and it was just a little oasis in the city of Paris. After that, we headed to the Pantheon, and it is a beautiful cathedral and building in Paris. It had many sculptures. But my most favorite part of the Pantheon were the crypts in the basement. It holds the tombs of Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Marie Curie, and many other famous national heroes of France. That night we got dressed up in our best French attire and headed to one of the little cafes in Montmartre near our hotel. We had a wonderful meal and a beautiful evening. On the way home, we stopped at a bakery and ate some macaroons and crepes. You can't leave Paris without having macaroons and crepes. The next morning, it was a rainy day, but we headed to Versailles. Versailles started as a little hunting cabin so that Louis XIV could escape Paris and get out into the countryside and hunt. It quickly became one of the largest and most famous palaces in all of Europe. Versailles is famous for the Grand Apartment, which was Louis XIV's residence. It also has a hall of mirrors that is just amazing to see, and the chapel of Versailles. It was a good place to spend a rainy day. The palace has 2,143 windows, 1,252 fireplaces, and 67 staircases. It is large and impressive to say the least. One of the things I wanted to see most were the gardens, but due to the rain, we didn't spend much time there. We decided to head back in Paris and visit the Museum Gerwin. The Museum Gerwin is a wax museum that holds over 300 famous wax sculptures of French nationals and also people from around the world. Here is me with Tony Parker. That night, we had dinner at La Petite Chase, which is the oldest restaurant in all of Paris. We then headed back on the subway and walked back to our hotel. One of the things that always struck me is there are just motorcycles everywhere. Again, we just loved the hotel that we stayed at, and here are some pictures of the hotel and the lobby. It was a very peaceful place and a perfect location. If I go back to Paris, and I hope I do, I would definitely consider staying there again. That morning, we walked to the famous Wall of Love, where the words "I love you" are written in every language from around the world. We took some pictures and then headed back to the Latin Quarter to go on a walking food tour of Paris. We stopped at 6 locations, several restaurants, some bakeries, and then also a food market. What we learned is that French love their food, and the 3 things that they love the most are bread and wine and cheese. The food market was a beautiful place full of fruits and vegetables and wonderful color. There were cheeses, and we had a cheese sampling and also some sampling of wine. After our food tour, we headed to the most colorful street in Paris. That night, my wife and I had tickets to see the famous Moulin Rouge. The theater was amazing. When you get your tickets for the Moulin Rouge, there are no seats listed on the ticket. Apparently, they assign them every day. Somehow, when we were seated, we ended up right next to the stage. And on this stage are some of the most famous dancers in the entire world. No cameras were allowed in the theater, and so this is some stock footage of the show that we saw.
"40 female and 20 male performers from 14 different countries make up the troupe. Throughout the evening's show, guests are taken on a journey from Broadway-style numbers to something a little more ethnic.
Visiting the Moulin Rouge was a great way to spend our last night in Paris, but unfortunately the next morning we had to head back to the airport. The Charles de Gaulle Airport was a very modern place, and one of my favorite things that they had was an arcade in the center of the waiting area. There were many games and they were all free. I spent probably over an hour playing Pac-Man, but eventually it was time to board our plane for our 9.5-hour flight back to Indianapolis. Paris, we had a great week, and we can't wait to return again. Thanks for the memories.